Well, good morning, Wild Goose. All right. I was told I was going to wake the goose, and I'm like, well, I'm not a morning person. So I hope you come like woken up, and here you are, and you're awake, and that's fantastic. I've said it. I bet you've said it. I bet a million times over the last couple days, but it is so good to be back here, to be back in this place with all of you. It really is. All ground is holy ground, right? But there's something like holy, holy about this ground when we're all together. So I'm so glad you're here. In our house, we have a family room. And in our family room, we have this bookshelf. And it's about this tall. And it's weighed down with all sorts of books. And many of the books came from school book fairs. Because when there's a book fair like there was last week, all of the grandparents send obscene amounts of money to buy extra books for the kids and little knickknacks at the book fair. Some of the books, though, are books that my wife and I have had since we were kids. And so there's a shelf of golden books, right? There's these little critter books. There's actually, I was relieved to know, because I love dad jokes. I love them so, I'm a dad. I like jokes. It just fits. And there's this little critter dad joke book that is just terrible from the 80s. And I'm so glad that my kids like to read from it. So one of our daughters, though, she can't read yet. She's 5. She just started kindergarten. But she will just get obsessed with different books on the shelf, and she'll get them and carry them around, and she'll look at the pictures, and she'll ask us to read from them. And so one day, not too long ago, she comes over to me, and she brings this book that she found on the shelf. And if you can't see it, it says, Great Bible Stories for Children, beautifully illustrated, and it has David and Goliath on the front. And she brings it over, and she's carrying it around, and she's looking, and she brings it over to me, and she flops it open to a specific page. And she says, Daddy, what's this story? Now, if you can see the illustration in the beautiful book, Bible Stories for Children, there is a man, Abraham, who has a knife held over his son. Now, if you don't know this story, I'm going to give you this is not the story I'm preaching about. I want you to understand, if you don't know the story, and if you don't know the story, this is a spoiler alert, but that's really on you because it's like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years old. You had time. This shouldn't be new information. So she brings this over to me, and she's like, what's this story? And here's the story. This man named Abraham has this sense, here's this voice, I don't know, and God says, here's what I want you to do. Take your son, your only son, the son you love, take him on this journey, take him up to this mountain, and when you get there, I want you to offer him, I want you to kill him, I want you to sacrifice him, because that's what I need. Do you know what Abraham does? He doesn't bat an eye. He's like, okay. Let's go. And the story in the Bible is excruciatingly painful because on the journey, his son, who's carrying the firewood, y'all, he is carrying the wood he's going to be offered on. And he says, I see the wood and I see the fire, but where's the lamb for the offering? And Abraham kind of looks over, he's like, just relax. God will see to it. And he takes him up, they go up on the mountain. Just like, what is Isaac thinking? Like, Dad, why are we building this? Why am I laying on this altar? And then there's the moment. The hand comes back, the knife. And God, of course, intercedes and says, no. Don't do that. I just wanted to see what you would do. And she opens this page, and this is the story. Daddy, what's this story? Oh, honey, well, this is a story about God just wanting to see what we do because God doesn't know. And this is God kind of just messing with us to see like, hey, I wonder if I can get this guy to almost kill his son. You think I could get this guy to almost kill his son? Let's see. And what happens to Abraham and Isaac's relationship after this? Like, what happens the next time Abraham says to Isaac, son, we're going on vacation? No, we're not. I am not going anywhere with you, man. And so when she brings me this book, she shows me this picture, I immediately said something to her like, baby, there are so many better stories for you to read. Let's go find another story. I'd forgotten this book existed, but in the front it is inscribed that my great-grandmother gave this book to me Christmas 1982, my second Christmas. She gave me a book on Bible, and then these memories came back of reading. I read these stories growing up. I went to church, and they put them on flannel graph in the church basement, and they taught me these stories. I know these stories. These stories, though, they really aren't stories for children, are they? Now, many of us learned them as children, and what happened when we learned them is we were not only taught stories, but there is no such thing as just giving somebody content without interpretation. It doesn't exist, right? Everything is interpreted. And so not only were we given stories, we were given lenses for how to read, understand, and interpret these stories. We were not only told this is a story, but we were told this is what the story means. This is what it means to understand the story correctly. And we were given all of these lenses. We were given all of this in our contacts. And most of the time, if they're working properly, I don't know they're there. In all of my life, I lived with these lenses for the Bible. These lenses of interpretation. These lenses that told me this is what the stories in the Bible are about. Everybody knows that it's just totally normal for a guy to take his son out into a mountain in the desert and try to kill him because his God told him to. If you were to hear this story anywhere else, you would say, oh my God. And one of the problems is the lenses we were given, that we inherited, we actually, when we grow and change, when we grow into adulthood, when we learn new things and we leave behind childish ways of thinking, those lenses actually never got addressed. And I found out in my mid-20s, I was reading the Bible with the same lens I was given in a Bible Stories for Children's book in 1982. I had all the same assumptions. I had all the same interpretations. And I realized something has to give. There has to be a better way, a grown-up way to approach the Bible. Because with everything else, I don't approach most things like I did when I was a kid. I have different questions. I notice different things. And so before, I want to do something with a Bible story this morning. Before I do that, I always like to give a disclaimer. And this may endear me to you, or you may be like, I'm out. I love the Bible. I love the Bible. I love it so much. My friend Jo Lumen was at GracePointe recently, and in her sermon she said, I think in Bible. And I was like, yes, that describes so much of who I am. When I hear something, when I think about something, I filter it through the lens of, I wonder how that works with this story. I wonder how that works with that text. I wonder, my imagination is soaked in the text. I love the Bible. As a kid in Sunday school, we spent ridiculous amounts of time trying to memorize it. Right? And so if there's a random verse from the King James Bible, I probably have it memorized because that's the Bible Jesus read. And so I love it dearly. I've tried to let it go. I've tried to be cynical about it. I've tried to say, why do we need a collection of texts from like Bronze Age 2 in the modern world? But these stories still speak. These stories capture imagination. These stories still move us. They move me, at least. And I absolutely am so frustrated about what I see happening with the Bible. And it's not new. It's been happening forever and ever, right? It's how the Bible gets used. And I even think the language of using the Bible is problematic. Because what are we using it for? Generally to prove we're right and somebody else is wrong. Generally to prove that we're inside and everybody else is outside. We use it more like a club to beat people up than a balm to provide healing. And I get it, it's complicated. There are stories in there about dudes who take their kids up and try to kill them on the top of a mountain. And we have to deal with those stories. But we have to deal with them like grown-ups. And so some of the work I've been doing is to ask questions about what would it look like to read the Bible as a grown-up. And I'm also trying to become aware of my own social location, how that impacts how I read the Bible. Right? I am a straight, white, cisgender American male. I now am at a point in my life where my initial interpretation of the Bible, I automatically am suspicious about. Because I end up reading the Bible almost initially always in ways that support me, that support my power, that support my privilege, that support the capitalist system that has worked okay for me. I end up reading the Bible in ways, I turn Jesus into somebody who he's just, a good American guy. And so I'm trying to now, the lenses, right, become aware. I have these lenses. I have a way of seeing this. I have a place from which I engage the Bible, that I engage these stories, that if I don't become aware of it, it has a major negative impact on not only how I interact with the Bible, but then what I think the Bible says, or how I make the Bible say. And so here's what I want to do. Today I want you to hear a story. It's a parable of Jesus. And it's, when I did this series at GracePointe called Bible Stories for Grown-Ups, I was like, I'm going to pick the hardest ones, and I'm going to dive into them. And I picked this story because somebody suggested it. And the week I sat down, I'll never forget, on my front porch, it was a lovely spring day, and I opened up the Bible to Matthew chapter 22, and I read the story, and I just like exhaled and said, Dear God, what have I committed to? This is like, you can say all you want, like everything Jesus says in the Bible's great. When you hear this, you're going to be like, Jesus didn't say that. The Jesus seminar said that that was like a black text, not a red letter text, right? Like Jesus can't possibly have said this. So I want to invite my friend Corey Dandridge up. Corey's a Grace Pointer, and Corey's going to read this text. And so before he reads this, two things. One, the context of this is important. Jesus tells this story during Holy Week in a conversation where religious leaders have just said, where did you get the authority to do and say all this? That is important for where this goes. Where did you get the authority to do this and to say this? And then second, maybe that's it. So, second, here's what I'd like you to do. If you've heard this story, try to hear it afresh. And I want you to pay attention to the characters in the story, because what we do with parables is we hear a character and we assign a actual, like, this is the God character, this is the Jesus character, this is the sinner character, or whatever. Listen for who, and begin to think about who is who in this story. Like, where does God show up in the story? Who is imaging God? Who is Jesus in the story? Corey, will you read that for us?
Good morning. I'm reading from the Common English Bible. Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Jesus responded by speaking again in parables. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding party for his son. He sent his servants to call those invited to the wedding party, but they didn't want to come. Again, he sent other servants and said to them, tell those who have been invited, look, the meal is all prepared. I've butchered the oxen and the fatted cattle. Now everything is ready. Come to the wedding party. But they paid no attention and went away, some to their fields, others to their businesses. The rest of them grabbed his servants and abused them and killed them. The king was angry. He sent his soldiers to destroy the murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his servants, the wedding party is prepared, but those who were invited weren't worthy. Therefore, go to the roads on the edge of the town and invite everyone you find to the wedding party. Then those servants went to the roads and gathered everyone they found, both evil and good. The wedding party was full of guests. Now, when the king came in and saw the guests, he spotted a man who wasn't wearing wedding clothes. He said to him, friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes? But he was speechless. Then the king said to his servants, tie his hands and feet and throw him out into the farthest darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth. Many people were invited, but few are chosen. The word of the Lord.
Corey Dandridge.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corey.
Now, how many of you heard that story before?
Oh, yeah.
How many of you like to pretend that story isn't in the Bible? It's kind of terrible on the front end, right? So what I want to do, I want to walk through the story and then maybe draw some things out. And then at the end, I want to maybe offer some, like, what does this have to do with us? What do we do with this? And first, the story begins, the parable begins, the kingdom of heaven is like. So parables, I'm sure you've heard this before. The word parable literally means to cast alongside. Parables were Jesus' way of trying to explain something that, like, maybe it's almost like saying, I don't even know how to explain this, but it's kind of like, right? I don't have words. If I tried to, like, just give you bullet points, it would not work. So let me, some people have said a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. I actually think we need to flip that. I think parables are heavenly stories with earthly meanings. And what I mean is they're not about a place up there, but parables are essentially about what would it look like, what does God's kingdom look like in its full effect in the world? Or what is God's kingdom advancing like? What is the kingdom of God like? And then Jesus tells stories that have practical sort of, and here's how it ends up working. And so this story begins with a king, a powerful ruler, throwing a wedding party for his son. How many of you think when you first heard this and you heard king, son, wedding party, you're like, I know who that is. Anybody? Who's the king? God. The son is Jesus. And the wedding party, like, have you read the book of Revelation? Right? Now here's the problem. What is the king like in this story? What is the king like? The king throws a party, people don't want to come, and so the king destroys their entire village. Is that what God is like? Is that the God Jesus talks to us about? Is that what God is like? Well, actually, sometimes the God I grew up with was a lot like that. I mean, there's this meme circulating on the internet that has Jesus standing outside the door. Has anybody seen this? And the text says, knock, knock. Like, who's there? Jesus. It's Jesus. Let me in. Why? So I can save you from what I'll do to you if you don't let me in. Evangelical theology in a meme. Right? Jesus wants to save us from what Jesus is going to do to us. So when we hear this stuff, for some of us, we were so conditioned that this is, of course, what God is like. God is love, but God is also willing to burn your city down if you won't come to her party. Like, this is what God is like. That if you don't make the right set of statements, if you don't sign off on the right doctrines, that someday when you die, you are going to be tortured forever and ever and ever. And look, if that's true, if that's actually how the story goes, then I think it is incumbent on us to choose hell out of protest. Because who wants to be with that God? That God is a torturer. That is not a God that you want to spend forever and ever and ever with. But this is what we've been conditioned to do. We've been conditioned to say, this is who God is. This is what God is like. You don't come to God's party, God will blow the whole thing up. Actually, you know who this sounds like? This sounds like Caesar or Herod or fill in the blank dictator and authoritarian figure. This is how they do business. This is how they order the world. You do what we say or we destroy you. And then when nobody will come, everybody's killed, and then the king says, well, now I guess just invite everybody, and they all come. Do you know why? They saw what he just did to the people who said no. They aren't there because like, hey, we got invited to a nice little wedding on Saturday. They're there because he just killed an entire village of people. We have to go. They're not there out of joy. They're there out of threat. They're not there because they wanted to go to the wedding. They are there because of what this figure will do to them if they don't show up. And then what happens? They're at the wedding. One person isn't dressed appropriately. I grew up Free Will Baptist. We eventually, when I was 11 years old, we went liberal and became Southern Baptist. But I grew up as a Free Will Baptist. And I can remember stories like this being used for, well, you have to wear your best to church. Because there's stories in the Bible where people didn't wear their best to church and God sent them to hell. You see why we need better readings of these stories? Because kids can't wear shorts to church. And they grow up, kids like me, grow up believing and having to unlearn that God is not a monster that is threatening us, that it's actually much more beautiful than that. And so this person shows up to the party in the wrong outfit. Now, here's what I didn't know. What makes this story fascinating is actually, this was not because the person didn't have access. In a Roman wedding, everybody shows up to the wedding and they are given a wedding garment. They are given it. It is given to them. They are like, you don't have to worry about what am I going to wear. They give it to you when you come in. So there's this one person who walked in. It's sort of like going to a nice restaurant in the 80s when they're like sport coat rule. Like if you didn't have one, they're like, here's a sport coat. He walks in and apparently says, nah, I'm good. I don't want your wedding garment. Do you know who I think Jesus is in the story? I think Jesus is that person. Now hear me out. I think Jesus is saying, I have completely opted out of this system of empire. I won't play by their rules. I won't do their thing. I'm not showing up at the party and pretending like this is okay, and I'm not showing up pretending like this is normal, and I'm not showing up pretending like this is how the world should work. I am showing. So where does Jesus get the authority? Jesus says, I'm the only one here saying no to this. I'm the one here saying I will not participate in a system, religiously, politically, or economically, that oppresses people, that harms people, that traumatizes people, and that terrorizes people. I won't do it. And what happens to Jesus as a result? Remember, this is Holy Week. Again, if you don't know where this is going, you had time to read it. He's about to be executed. What happens at the end of the story? Execution. We have so misunderstood the Bible, but you know why I couldn't see that for years? Because I was taught to read the Bible, and it was my lens, and the only way I could see it is in a way that propped up me and propped up my power and didn't make me ask hard questions. You know what I think when I read that story? That's hard. What do I do with a Jesus who says, I'm not going to participate in a system that hurts people when my entire life has been built participating on systems that have continually hurt people? Like, you don't read that. You don't hear that sermon and then go to lunch and go, that was lovely. Right? That was lovely. That was really, really nice. I think Jesus is telling a subversive story. You know why I've got authority? Because I'm willing to opt out of the system, and I'm willing to take this wherever it has to go. Even across. Even if it costs everything. And there's this terrible line at the end of the story. Many are invited, but few are chosen. What if that is not the kingdom of God? What if that's the kingdom of Rome? What if that is a statement about how empire works? What if Jesus is not saying, and this is how God does things. God invites everybody, but not everybody gets in. So Jesus clearly wasn't a Calvinist. Can we just say that? Like, everybody gets an invite, but not everybody gets into the party. What if that's not at all? What if Jesus is not saying this is prescriptive? What if he's saying this is descriptive about how the world works? And we should change it. We should change it. And so when I read this story in the traditional interpretation, which by traditional I mean I don't think Jesus nor his followers would understand the way we have read this story. I think they would hear the way we read it and they would say, sounds like people who grew up in the empire and it worked well for you. What do we do with this story? So I just want to give you a couple things. First, I think we desperately need to reimagine God. We desperately need to reimagine our understanding of God. The fact that we come to these stories and the God character for us is the one doing the most damage. And friends, to be honest with you, people who live outside of the Christian bubble, that has been their experience of God for so many people. God has been the one showing up to destroy their cities. God has been the one showing up to kick them out. God has been the one showing up to punish them for not wearing the right thing, believing the right thing, doing the right thing. We have created a God who is a monster. And in so many ways violated the very essence of who Jesus talked about when Jesus talked about God. We need to reimagine God. And we don't need to do it just for us. We need to do it for the world. Because so much has been done in the name of the Christian understanding of God. So many abuses have been legitimized. We have subjugated and enslaved people in the name of the Christian God. We have taken and stolen and pillaged in the name of the Christian God. We have made a desert and called it peace in the name of the Christian God. And you know, I have no real desire to convert people anymore. The only people I want to convert are Christians. Like, I want to convert Christians. I'm out to convert Christians. But the whole world could benefit from Christians who have a better understanding and image for God. A God who doesn't want to destroy, but a God who longs to heal. A God who is not somewhere else, but a God who is right here among us. A God who is not looking to punish and exclude, but a God who says there's enough room for every living, breathing human being. We need a new image of God. So that when we hear these stories, we go like, I don't know, but I know who God isn't in that story. God isn't the one wreaking havoc and swinging a sword. God is the one doing the healing thing. And then I think we need to reimagine where we find Jesus. We need to reimagine where we find Jesus. Where does Jesus show up? In this story, Jesus shows up with the oppressed. Jesus shows up with the marginalized. Jesus shows up with us. And here's the thing. God cannot have victims because God stands with victims. God cannot oppress because God stands on the side and wills the liberation of the oppressed. Where do we find Jesus? I think if we read from this lens, all through the Bible, we find Jesus doing that work. We find Jesus liberating. I think one of the most powerful things about Jesus, I don't know what I believe. I tend to not necessarily always believe that the miracle stories in the Gospels are literal, but here's what I think the true profound, you know what the profound miracle is of Jesus? Going up to somebody who has been ostracized because they have been deemed unclean and left out, putting an embrace around them and saying, see, there's nothing. See, you can embrace them. You can bring them in. There is nothing to fear. What if we were to reimagine Jesus, and it's not actually making it up whole cloth, it's just what's in the text? The Jesus we meet in the pages of the Bible, who goes to places no one else will go, who embraces the people no one else will embrace, and who calls his followers to do the exact same work. Jesus never actually called us to build churches. He never called us to build monuments. He never really even called us to have budgets, but he did call us to go and embrace and love and be a presence of healing and justice and compassion in the world. And then just a thing about authority, because this is the thing that I find really interesting. This whole parable comes up because of a conversation about authority. And one of the things I hear the church writ large, in America specifically, really whining a lot about is, well, we've lost our authority. People used to, do you hear this from a lot of religious institutions? Like we used to have power over people. Like we could just make them feel guilty by driving by our sign. And we don't have that same authority anymore. Here's why the church lost whatever authority the church had. The church lost its authority because on every single issue where we should have chosen to lead, we chose to do the opposite. Instead of leading toward abolition, churches in the South preach slavery and segregation. Instead of leading for the full equality of women in the community, we still have churches and places where women are silenced. Instead of celebrating and affirming the LGBTQ plus community, the church has continually harmed, traumatized, and excluded. Instead of leading the charge on climate change, we're going like, but Genesis says. Every major opportunity we've had, we have forfeited our authority because we were more concerned with keeping our privilege, more concerned with keeping the budget right, more concerned with keeping numbers up, and Jesus is standing there without a wedding garment going, if you want to join this party, then you have to be willing to go through the consequences of joining this party. If you want to be a part of building this thing called the kingdom of God, it isn't like just going to church and hearing a nice sermon and going to lunch. It actually looks like refusing at times to participate. It looks like stepping out of line. It looks like doing the hard, difficult things that may put you at odds with people you care about. How many of you right now, you've lost relationships because your faith changed? Yeah, that's hard, isn't it? How many of you have lost opportunities, jobs, anything else because your faith changed and you couldn't lie about it anymore? You had to be honest about it, and it cost you. Yeah, because that's actually how this works. You don't push back on a system that is working really well for a lot of people and say, but what about the people you're harming? Without there being consequences. A few years ago at Wild Goose, I was standing right over there, I'd been walking by, and I just happened to notice that Reverend William Barber was on the stage. And I'm so glad I ended up for like the last 10 minutes of his talk that day, that sermon. He was preaching. I mean, and before he dropped the mic, literally, and the first thing I thought was, I wonder how much that mic cost. Like, just drops it. He's preaching and he's preaching and he's preaching and he's preaching. And then he said something, and I never forget it. I went and wrote it down as quickly as I possibly could. He said, and this is paraphrased, but he said, here's what we have to decide. We can either be the priests of empire or the prophets of God, but we can't be both. And friends, I think that is the story, that is the choice, that is the challenge, that is the invitation, that is the critique, that is the demand, that is what this parable is calling us to. Where will we wind up on this priest of empire, prophet of God thing? Because that decision will shape not only who we become and not only who the church becomes, but in large part because of the influence of our faith in the world, it will shape partly how the world becomes. And it is incumbent upon us to make the good choice, the difficult choice, the challenging choice. It's time to take off the wedding party garment and say, I refuse to participate in things in ways that are harming other human beings. There are better grown-up ways to read the Bible, and I think we need to do it. Amen? Thank you.